you know what it feels like to be discriminated against. And you know what it feels like to be like, there's a group of guys walking towards me. Are they gonna say anything about my appearance? Do I have to, like, where do I look? Do I look straight ahead? Do I look on the ground? Do I look to the side? Do I cross the street, right? It's like, so the tension is there and you feel it and it is very real. And so I think that's absolutely like right to tap into that, because it's just like women and people who pass for women of the world unite. Like, you know, the struggle. It is very, very hard.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another podcast episode. Today I have my dear friend Leslie, who is like one of the smartest and most well-spoken people I know. And if you know me, that's like one of the highest compliments I can pay somebody. So Leslie, thanks for being here.
Yes, thank you for having me and for those nice words. I was like, now I can't say like or the way I normally do. So
Not at all. It's totally fine. I say those things all the time. But I think people will know what I mean when we start talking. So the first thing I wanted to start with, because I feel like this is very on brand for you, and I just wanted to start off on a broad note, is just like activism in general. And I wanted to know, like, what was your path to becoming the activist that you are now? And you can give a little bit of like a story of like your upbringing and stuff like that, because I think coming from similar-ish backgrounds, like you're somebody I look up to very much in terms of activism, and I'm curious to how you got there.
Yeah, okay, that's a very good question. I think it's two-pronged in terms of the kind of activism and organizing that we've been seeing over the last couple of weeks as it relates to the movement for Black Lives. That very much started this year. But I think in terms of the work that I've always been doing, in terms of being someone who's focused very intently on climate change and social impact, that actually started when I was really young. I remember when I was in fourth grade, growing up in Southern California, it's like we're always in a drought, and we always had these assemblies that were like reduce, reuse, and recycle. And so I was learning that at school, and then for my parents, like being immigrants and coming here, they were very cost conscious. And so we recycled at home and we reused things and we composted things. And so it was just that coupled with what I was learning at school kind of just clicked in my mind. And I was like, yes, the environment and our resources are finite. We gotta take care of it. Everybody knows this. Cool. And I remember very distinct moments throughout elementary school when I realized that not everybody felt the same way. One was I remember going to a sleepover with some of my friends and someone left the water on while they were brushing their teeth. And I was like, we literally had an assembly of what are you doing? And then I also remember I was carpooling to school with some friends once, and we were talking about the Bush Gore election as like fucking 9-year-olds.
Wow.
But we were talking about it, and people were just saying like, oh, who would you vote for? And then someone in the front seat said Bush. And I was like, I would vote for Al Gore because he cares about the environment. I very distinctly remember that. And then the funniest story is I was shopping with my mom at Whole Foods in Pasadena, and we were checking out, and the bagger, he's, gathering all of our groceries, and then so he looks over and he says, do you want paper or plastic? So this was that long ago that Whole Foods was still using plastic. Mm-hmm. And I said, I looked at it, I said, paper, obviously. And he goes, oh, like, do you want to wrap your books? Like, do you need it for school? And I said, no, because it's better for the environment. Like,
of course. Like, why would you even ask?
And so I think just like all of those instances kind of triangulated within me at a very young age, which is why I've always wanted to work in climate, because it was interesting for me to understand that there are different, even though we could come from the same background, we could get the same input, people will still the way people behave will be different. So how do you try to address those behavioral differences? Do you do it from a policy perspective? Do you do it from a consumer perspective? Do you work the private sector? Is it public sector? Is it something in the middle? And so I think that was my path to just ending up in consulting also, which is working with NGOs on policy the answer? And now that I am no longer working a full-time job, the intent for this year was, let me try to understand what it's like to work from the bottom up. Because I've done a lot of the top down. I've done the policy, I've worked with large foundations. What is it like to be on the ground pushing this work when sometimes activists and organizers are at odds with policymakers? So that's how I got started with it this year. It also coincided with the 2020 presidential elections, which in 2016, I was still at Cambridge, so I couldn't do any campaigning. I just Bernie from afar and like absentee voted in the primaries, and they came back and voted for Hillary. So this year was I made more of an effort to try to get into that. Yeah. So that's the backstory of how I got here. I do want to differentiate between, because you use the term activism, and I think within the world that I have been in, which is the political organizing world for electoral policies, within these circles, we tend to call it organizing, because activism calls to mind something that's very big and flashy, like demonstrations, protests, rallies, banner drops, you occupy a street, there's a march, something. And organizing is a less sexy term, but it really encompasses more of the work that is entailed in trying to push for change. Because it's never going to be a one-off action. It's never just going to be, we do this march and then something will change and then we pat ourselves on the back because that's it, right? Because politicians are experts at co-opting the language of social justice movement and saying, we did something, look at this website, we're really good at using graphics and we made this plan, and it's good at diverting people's attention away from that and from the issue at hand. But you always have to try to ask yourself, okay, so you did something. Is it the something where we wanted you to go? If not, what's the gap still, right? You may have taken one step forward, but did you also take 2 steps back? And so organizing is a lot about thinking very holistically about the change that you are trying to affect and recognizing that it is a lot of work. Because I think one of the criticisms that I find myself thinking about coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement is that you've probably been able to see this too. A lot of the energy has dissipated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Right. And, there were these big social media campaigns that people rallied around, right? Like posting the Lex Square, or, like the different things that you can post on your Instagram story, which is great. But what happens after, right? Like what happens after you do that? And I think organizing and thinking about yourself as an organizer is all about recognizing no matter whether or not you choose to engage, there will always be something to fight about. And knowing that there's always something to fight about, you also have to recognize that there's a lot of just grunt work involved, like a lot of the work that goes into like electoral cycles is like calling and texting people, which is, we got a glimpse of that, right? With trying to call and submit your comment for a budget hearing.
Yep.
Or sending a letter to your elected official. That's a glimpse of the very intense work that goes into organizing. So I do want to make that distinction.
Okay.
But it seems like also I think a lot of people, and you nodded when I said this, see that there's been kind of a drop off in engagement. So I would also be curious to ask you if you have been thinking about that and the reasons for that.
Definitely. I think it's so tough to grapple with. And even when I started to get more involved, I think, and this is probably a lot of people, there was a hesitation of kind of making a statement, getting involved, saying yes, I'm in this and I'm in it for the long run, because inertia is going to like take its course and the energy will kind of like wane a little bit. And if that's the inevitable course, then is it worth it to like put yourself out there and say like, all right, let's like keep this going? And even on social media now, you can see there's like that push and pull of, hey, this movement is all over, let's keep it going. And then there are people who are like, okay, well, let's find more sustainable ways to do it. You don't have to be doing every single little thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's something that I grapple with racism or any sort of social justice movement where you feel like you want to be all in and you want to be in it, whatever that means. But also, if you are in it, do you have to feel bad about not doing like every single little thing that you can do? Because there's a way to be perfect. Is that way realistic? Maybe not, but like there's always more that you can do, right? And for me, it's like, okay, where do I say that it's okay that I didn't do it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard because I think the more you, well, I have two thoughts here. One is I think this year, whether it's like the pandemic giving people more time, right? And like there were no sports, so there was like nothing to watch on TV, and there were no cars. People were able to mobilize, and like, you know, corporate media was able to very specifically hone in on this. So I don't know what conditions led to so many people becoming activists and organizers for the first time over the last couple of months. Like, I don't know what the conditions are, but I do think this is the first time probably in history that so many people had the veil lifted in a very like sharp and uncomfortable way. And we probably learned more on our own in 2 weeks than we had throughout the entirety of high school, right? Learning about slavery and understanding what systemic racism means, which is, and that's like, and that's commentary on public education, but
For sure.
yeah, but because we've done that now, there's this opportunity to say, okay, well, now we've mobilized a bunch of people in the way that we weren't able to before. Because if previously organizers and activists might have been seen as fringe, whereas now so many people have been brought into the fold. So how do you keep them engaged? And that's a question that I ask myself as well, because there is no shortage of things that you can involve yourself in, but also burnout is super real and mental health is so key. And also in the midst of a pandemic, you need to take care of yourself, like first and foremost. I took a huge step back in social media because I knew I was burned out. But I was like, it's fine. Like, I don't need to justify that I'm not doing this to anyone, because I know that I care about this and I know I'm going to care about the work that I do. So I think it comes down to like yourself, right? It's, are you the kind of person who wants to know that you fought for something, right? Or are you okay with doing your 9 to 5 and saying like, I donated my money and that's the way I'm gonna help, and be okay with that? Because I think it's really unfair to let people guilt trip you. Yeah. And it comes down to like, is this how you want to engage? Do you want to engage? Which I think the answer should be yes. Like, I can shame you for not wanting to engage, period. But then the how is up to you.
Definitely. I think a lot of it comes down to like optics also, where
Yes.
you want to be
Good point.
perceived as somebody who like really cares and is like posting on social media all the time and like doesn't let up at all. And I had this realization maybe a couple months ago where I was like, honestly, no one cares about my reputation as an activist. Like, if I think I'm doing okay, if I post once a day, or if I post once a week, or if I don't post at all about racism or feminism or whatever it is, the environment, as long as I know that I'm doing my part, like you said, it should be okay. And I had the feeling that like, oh, people are gonna judge me for like not doing my part. And there's all those posts floating around on social media of like, we see your silence, like I know that you didn't post about it and you didn't speak out. And like I get that. I I feel like there is a reason, there's some good to be had with like a little bit of shame and guilt tripping. But at the same time, in my mind, I was like, okay, I'm not gonna let it get to me. Nobody actually cares about my reputation of being active or not. Like, it's just on me.
And that right there, which I'm really glad you brought up, I think is the key difference between activism and organizing, right? Because activism is like, you do this thing, it's big, it's flashy, and like, boom. Organizing is, you have to think about who you're talking to. You have to think about who your audience is, and then you have to meet them where they're at. Like if I'm on the phone and I'm calling someone in Kansas, I'm gonna try to talk to them about Bernie. I'm not gonna be like, so Trump is racist.
Uh-huh.
That's just not going to be your approach, right? And so I think the same, you have to do it you have to look at that for yourself as well, which is optics and branding and clout is such a big part of how we live our lives now, and that really matters to approximately 0 people. It doesn't even matter for us. And so to do a thing for this thing that doesn't matter, it's just like, why? I'm tired. Like my back hurts.
My back hurts. Well, like in talking to people who may not have similar opinions as you, and this is a whole other conversation because I feel like in my immediate circles for the most part, and even familially, kind of, like most people I know share my viewpoints, and I don't have to like convince them to see the light for the most part. But what, like, have you had any really successful or like super unsuccessful conversations in trying to in conversing with people with different viewpoints?
Yes, yeah, I would say the hardest and currently most unsuccessful conversation is one with my parents. And that's tricky. I think we started talking about this because I think my parents were like, their mentality was, specifically as it related to protesting and Black Lives Matter, they took the stance of, well, Obama was president, or like Oprah is very successful. Like, why can't all Black people rise up in society? And my mom specifically was like, it is the responsibility of Black parents to educate their children. And I was like, okay, all parents want what's best for their kids, right? Like you can't possibly believe that like Black parents just like, yeah, just like send their kids out into the wild and like don't care about them at all. So then I was like, okay, so then now I have to explain what it means to have something be systemic, right? I have to explain the concept of institutions to them, which I think that's hard also because it's easier for me to do that in English than it is in Mandarin. So I'm just gonna have to make you these like flow charts on PowerPoint to show you that, like defunding the police is step 1. Step 2 is the criminal justice system, which is bigger, and they unfairly target Black and brown communities. Why is that? Let's look at the history. But it's hard because I think my parents view themselves as working class, which is absolutely the case when they came here to the States. But they're not working class in the way that working class societies are working class. I was like, y'all are not living paycheck to paycheck. Like, you're not working class.
Yeah.
And it's hard to shake them of that because they grew up poor, right? They came here with nothing. They were able to succeed and build a life for themselves. And I try to make them recognize that they were able to do that. It's the whole like white privilege thing, right? Like just because you have white privilege doesn't mean you don't suffer in your own way. But you need to that your skin color is not a barrier, which I think is also that's also a tricky conversation to have with my parents because like people are fucking racist, Asians, and there is absolutely a bamboo ceiling, and so trying to pick apart the nuances of that was really hard. I had to step away from the conversation and say, like, we need to agree on some basic facts first. Let me send you some things to read, and then we can have this conversation again. That was very
And
fun.
did they do that? And did that help?
My mom, well, okay, so my mom did. She said she started looking at some of the resources and then she started talking to some of her Black friends, which I think also, thankfully, my parents have Black friends,
Okay.
which I think is like a helpful starting point because it's like you might not take my word, but you can take this thing that I gave you and you can talk to somebody else about it because you're probably going to listen to someone else more than you're going to listen to me. So I think they understand more of the systemicness of society now. They see that a little bit more. I think they still don't feel any of the nuances of what it and like understand how difficult it is to be Black in America, and also, you know, the difficulties of just like in the problems of US history in general, because they were never taught that. So we've kind of just we landed on it's fine for me to go protest if I go get myself tested on the reg.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I can understand how Asian parents would think that way, and especially with the protests. Like,
Yeah.
I think my parents felt the same, and they were like, "Yeah, you know, Black Lives Matter. We understand that it's great that there's a movement, but like, you don't go out there and like protest. Don't do that. There's a pandemic," which, you know, totally fair. Um, so I feel like this has been common discourse too, but like in Asian culture, it's very much like, all right, we'll like keep to ourselves. Like, oh great, like good job you over there. Like I'll just stay back and watch.
Mm-hmm. Which is very much the myth of the model minority, right? Which is we are as collectively as Asians, which also is like an all-encompassing term, but also exclusionary. Asians are led to believe that if you work hard and you have this ethos of keeping your head down, that you will be able to succeed because, you know, we don't suffer many of the things that Black and brown communities suffer. But it's like, but you don't see Asians in positions of power, right? And so this idea of the model minority, it's like, yeah, we're there to make white people feel good about the fact that there is a group, there's a community of color that is able to succeed relatively so within American society, and it's helpful for them to point to us and say, look at all these Asians. Let's
Mm-hmm.
look at doing. Look at their like median income. Look at those big houses in Arcadia that they're able to buy. And that's very detrimental to advancing racial justice for everybody.
Yeah. Do you feel like it's that way for any person of color who has achieved some level of high achievement that somehow, I don't know how to put this, but let's say like Obama and Oprah, that they're like held to this standard of like, oh, okay, well, look at them, they did it. Like, how does that play into to kind of what we're talking about of like the model minority?
That's a good point. Um, I'm not sure because on one hand, I want to say if there is a path, right? If these people were able to succeed and they are not the only ones in that field, although to date Obama is the only one Black president, right? But nonetheless, there are Black congressmen, there's many Black and brown leaders and CEOs. It's like if there are people there, then that means that there is a defined path. On the flip side, if there is a defined path, then the proportion of people there should be proportionate to the percentage of that community within the entirety of the population, right? It would just be one or two people. And then so you start asking, okay, well then why is that? And then the very cynical side of me is like, okay, well that's because in some way, shape, or form, race, even even if you're Black or brown, right, can sometimes serve as affirmative action to service, again, like the narrative that white people are trying to push. That's a very glass half empty.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, okay, my thought is I'm making a parallel to, I think, something that happens a lot with like women, where
Mm-hmm.
we can climb the ladder and we don't want to help bring other people up. Do you feel
Mm-hmm.
that happens with people of color, not just Asians, who are like, hey, I made it to this top spot and
Yeah.
I'm sitting comfortable and now I don't feel like I need to help anymore?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That is very interesting. I don't, I can't say definitively what the answer is, but I think a nuance of that, which actually lends itself to our discussion, is class, which we never talk about and which I think should be talked about more within society. Because in a way, class is the thing that brings together like racism, sexism, whatever isms, right? Because if we ensured like equal economic opportunity for all, then we wouldn't be seeing these things manifesting itself in the workplace, right? Like we wouldn't be talking about like, oh, like women need to be paid like equal pay, right? It's just like we are missing these things right now, and that manifests itself within sexism, that manifests itself as the patriarchy. If we talked explicitly about class, which makes people uncomfortable because it's about money,
Yeah.
we would be able to have just a wider lens to look at society. And I think the thing with class is that even within the Asian community, right, there's a lot of racism, and a lot of that racism is tied to just like poor and middle income countries within like diaspora, right? And I think that is very much the case across all cultures, where it's not necessarily, maybe it's like, it's not necessarily that you don't want to help other people. It's maybe you only want to help a certain kind of people because you want your culture to be represented in the way that you are representing them. And that creates another layer of distinction there that only people within that culture recognizes. I'm thinking very specifically about how a lot of my Black friends who went to Ivy Leagues just like really did not like the attitudes that like other Black people within the Ivy League exhibited, because they thought it was very condescending. It was very like, I'm better than you and I'm God's gift to earth because I'm here and I made it despite all odds, rather than having the perspective of, let me try to lift up everybody else around me because I am here and it took me, like, it was fucking hard to get here. And they complain about that a lot. They're also women talking about men. But they complain about that a lot, which is why I think it's really at the core a class issue.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I also think like where's the space, and this is kind of what brought me to my first question of like what brought you to the path that you're on right now, because I'm going to bring this really broad, but as human beings, we're very selfish creatures, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's just, it's just in our nature to look out for ourselves.
Yes.
And everybody is disadvantaged in some ways. Like nobody, even if you're like a white man, you could have like some personality that makes you disadvantaged in the workplace or whatever it may be. Like it makes me think how we balance, I guess, advancing ourselves versus kind of lifting all boats, you know? And obviously there is a way to do both, but does one take away from the other? And is there an argument there for people to say like, okay, well, I just want to I want to do the best for me, and it means that it's going to take away from work on other people.
Yeah. I mean, the way that where my mind went to is this idea that capitalism cannot exist without socialism. We are absolutely seeing that right now, where everything that is fixing the problems presented by COVID-19 are socialist solutions. But socialism also cannot exist without capitalism, because you need to incentivize people to work. People need to feel like they have dignity. People need to feel like they're working towards something, and people need to feel like they're doing it on their own. And so it's really interesting, because I think so much of this pandemic is showing us that humans actually need each other. We deeply crave human connection, and we need that in order to thrive and survive. At the same time, what does that mean in terms of how we grow as a country? And I think it goes back to policy for me, progressive policies, because if you want to empower individuals to achieve their greatest potential, then what aspects of like Maslow's hierarchy can the government provide for them such that they are able to get to that point of self-actualization, right? Like if you can have like a housing guarantee, if you can have universal health care, if you can have free education, right? Not just K through 12, K through 16, then you're effectively, even though these are very socialist policies, you're effectively investing in every single citizen to then go out and be more productive, right? Which yields, in like a neoliberal capitalist sense, greater yields for your economy, right? Like everyone's productivity levels are gonna go up. They're not gonna be stressed out thinking about like, how am I gonna put my kid through education? The government covers that. Then everything that they're getting from work, they reinvest into themselves or the economy. So for me, that's kind of the way to like, the like rising tide lifts all boats, but also you're empowering individuals, because then individuals still have the latitude to work as hard or not as hard as they want to, and you can still have this meritocratic system, which even though we don't exist in a meritocracy, but you people still get what they deserve while you account for the basic needs for all people. That's why I think progressive policies are so important, because it brings together those two trains of thought, which I think is so important to have in mind, right? And which is why like the term democratic socialism has come into vogue as of late, because more and more people are realizing the contradictions of capitalism, right? Where you try to squeeze every ounce of labor from a human, and that's like you are like, your value comes from the work that you do. But if you were to automate everything, then that work no longer becomes valuable, which is like inherently a paradox.
First of all, I think you should run for president. Okay, like I'm gonna bring this back to kind of like my first question.
Yeah.
And you can tell like I'm trying to tease out a story here, because I feel like in the thoughts going through my mind right now is like, how do I get there? You know, like how can I, like how has it taken us, the country, so long to come up with these types of ideas, or really for these types of ideas to reach a little bit more of the mainstream? And I don't think it's super mainstream right now.
Yeah.
But I'm curious to know like your personal journey of like how you've gotten to this level of thinking from like what you said earlier of like caring for the environment and things like that. And I wanted to touch upon the fact that you said like, oh, you know, coming from similar backgrounds, even like people who you grew up around, you noticed that like your friend left the faucet on, and that was something that was like very weird to you, or like didn't make sense. Where did your path diverge?
I think the answer that I think is the right one is not going to be an answer you anticipate, because I think the answer comes down to ego.
Mm.
And it comes down to the fact that it comes down to how I was raised, which is, it's very Asian though, right? Because I'm sure you can relate to this, in which Asian households very much view you as a kid tied to what you do, like the grades that you got in school, the extracurriculars that you were doing, and who you are as a person is not differentiated from these things that you are accomplished in and these skills that you have. This is very much the case in my household. And so it's, if I wanted my parents to pay attention to me, I needed to do something extraordinary. I couldn't be normal. I couldn't just be like, I like got good grades, which I like only sometimes got because I wasn't actually great at school, right? Like I think the way my mind works and like the way I connect the dots is not how you learn in America, because it's all about like you take these AP classes and you take the SAT prep and then you go to a college and it's just like you check all of these different boxes, where I think very much in the abstract. And so for me, it's like in the absence of being able to get really good grades, I looked for other ways to excel. And the other ways that I could excel were extracurriculars. And the way I differentiated myself in like what I believed in and how I expressed that in my day to day. And so I think it very much started off as a way to just like get my parents' attention. Somewhere along the way, I think it became intertwined with my ego of like, I am doing this thing for external praise and validation. But also, I like this thing that I'm doing now. And maybe the external praise and validation piece will always be there. And maybe like I probably have to disentangle this in therapy. Like and and maybe that's unhealthy, but it's hard for me to say anymore because it is so core to who I am.
Yeah.
But I actually think that's how it started.
That is so fascinating. It's funny because, like, you're right. I mean, it's not really an answer that you would expect. But now that you say that, like, it makes perfect sense. You know,
Yes.
we're all human. I don't I don't know. This is maybe the like cynical side of me. I don't know if we're like necessarily all that altruistic
Mm-hmm.
naturally.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting to see where that comes from, and now it's such like a core part of your identity that you don't even know really what that mesh of like intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation is.
Mm-hmm.
But huh, that's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it's. I think the short answer of that is it's a combination of both nature and nurture, right? Um, but the longer answer becomes more complicated, and
Yeah.
it's interesting to think about, right? And it's interesting to think about how like very successful politicians or like philosophers and thinkers might have been raised, because I think in if you grow up with complete privilege, then you, which actually goes back to like Black Lives Matter movement and like everything that's going on, then you're not forced to confront with the things in society that are uncomfortable,
Mhm.
because you don't need to, right? You don't need to think about that, right? If everything is given to you, if you have a path, like if you are like fully well loved, then you live your path and then you're just like very happy. Whereas I think it's, if you are presented with challenges, then how do you adapt to those challenges, and then how does that inform who you are,
Yeah.
what comes out of that.
Yeah. That's so interesting. And I'm like gonna tell a story that is like somewhat related to that story that you told in the beginning about you learning about climate change and having auditoriums about this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I I don't want to say I've been like super environmentalist for many years, but my earliest memories of it was coming from when I was a kid, and I also have a similar story about how I learned about how money worked. But I was I was like at my house, and I left my room, and my mom goes, "Oh, Van, turn off the lights." And I was like,
Mm.
"Okay, sure. Why would I do that?" Like, then when I go back, they're already on. And my mom's like, "Well, the lights are using electricity. We have to pay for that, you know? And I was like, what? We have to pay for it? I was like, it doesn't just like come out of the walls? And she was like, no. And that flipped a huge switch for me. And maybe this is just like my Asian genes, but I was like, money saving? I'm turning off every single light. And I got into the habit of like before when my mom would call me down for dinner, I would turn off my light. I would go to my brother's room and turn off his light because he was terrible at it. Like go to my parents' room, make sure their bathroom lights are off. Like all the lights upstairs would be off. And a couple days later, I went over to my friend's house and like she left her light on before going to dinner. And I was like, hey, dude, like turn off the lights. You know, that costs money, right? You know, it doesn't just come out of the walls. And she was like, what? And she had no idea either. And like that was, I don't know why that made such a big impact on me. And like only much later did I learn like the actual environmental impacts of what was happening and like why that, like it kind of clicked a little bit more and now I have a bigger reason to do it. But it really started off as like a selfish like, oh, I'm gonna save like my family money, which I don't know how much that would save. Now I see electricity bills and they're not that expensive and I'm like, okay mom, really, okay, it would have been fine, but
Oh my god, that's so funny. It doesn't just come out of the wall.
I really thought that.
But I think like that's such a powerful story, right? Because to me, it illustrates two things. One, the importance of meeting people where they're at. Because if your mom were to tell you about like climate, you probably would have that's just so much more abstract than like it's saving money. Yep. And two, the saving money part speaks to how like in order to incentivize people, they need to have the like short-term tangible benefits that they see right in front of them. Yeah. Which is why climate is kind of a tricky topic, at least in the way that it's discussed, I think, in society. Climate is very abstract and people don't understand how it affects them, right? If they're like, not that people go around thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but it's like that is so far and beyond self-actualization that people don't really commit the time to think about it. But actually, climate fucking affects the very bottom, like your survival, right? Yeah. And so it's just like, how can we change the discourse so that people understand, like, if it gets hotter in LA, your AC bills are 100% going to go up, and we want to avoid that, which is why we need to vote for progressive politicians. It's like, that's the kind of message we should be putting out there, not rising sea levels in Florida or wherever.
Yeah, because it doesn't directly impact you. Yeah, climate is a really, really tricky one to talk about, but also the education around how to be better at climate change, honestly, is really, really awful. And I remember seeing your like Instagram stories maybe a couple months or weeks ago, and you had like facts about climate change and like how to recycle and things like that, which are amazing. And like a couple years ago when I was doing my master's, I wanted to do my thesis on like somewhat within like the upcycling realm, and so I learned a lot about that kind of stuff, but nobody knows how to recycle. And also recycling here is awful. No one really knows how it works, no matter how much research you do.
Yeah, it actually blows my mind because I think because the last place I lived like really permanently was SF, where compost bins were the norm, whereas now that I'm back here in LA, it is not the norm here. Composting is not really a thing here that I've been able to see. You don't get like the landfill, recycling, compost, waste diversion bins the way you would at any random restaurant like Suvla, whatever, in San Francisco, which is like mind-boggling to me. but also, yeah, so that's one point. The second point is I always get stories from my friends that are like, today I saw that someone threw a glass container into the compost and it really infuriated me. So I took it out and I thought you would appreciate that. But it's like, yeah, how did someone think it was okay to throw a glass container into the compost bin? That's crazy.
Well, at work, now at my previous job, like I would always tell my coworkers like, oh no, that one doesn't go in compost, or like, no, you can't actually recycle that, like don't put it in there, like this one actually has to be trash and whatnot. And there's just so little education, and also
Mm-hmm.
there's like no, I mean there's no consequence for doing it wrong, or
Yeah.
there's no immediate consequence, which kind of goes back to what you were saying. But if you go to like other countries, like Korea, for example, I don't know if you've seen their whole like waste management system, but
Mm-mm.
it's amazing. And it's probably a little bit more than what normal people would tolerate, but everybody there separates everything. There's like 6 or 7
Mm.
different bins that you go to and separate out all of your stuff, and the rest of it goes to the trash. And I think you have to pay for your trash by weight. So if you don't
Oh,
separate
that's
it,
so
if
interesting.
you don't separate it right, and if you're lazy and everything goes to the trash, you got to pay more for it.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. I think actually that's the case in Germany as well, where it's like there's like 5 million bins that you gotta sort your own shit into. Which I mean, yeah, it speaks a lot to just the education bit, because if it's just fully ingrained into society, then it's not even something you have to think about. So I was actually gonna ask how you learned, because recycling is not really a thing that's taught here.
No, I
Not
just,
here though.
yeah, I took an interest to it. I mean, growing up in Shanghai, I didn't know anything about it, so that didn't have to do with it. But when I was in London, I took an interest to it, and I just started learning more about it and like looking into it on my own. And I was like, wow, I didn't know any of this before. I didn't know that like you couldn't recycle certain things. I didn't know that you had to clean stuff before you put it in. And if you find things that are not in the whole category of recyclables, then the whole thing goes to waste. And I was like, how come more people don't know about this? At the same time, when the collective doesn't know about it, like at work, I was like, oh God, like it am I really making a dent? Because nobody seems to know anything. And like I can recycle everything and somebody's gonna throw their tinfoil in, and like then the whole thing is going to be gone.
Yes. I know recycling is one of those things where it's the well, I mean, and you know all about how like China refuses to take the US's recyclables
Mm-hmm.
anymore, right? And it's like knowing that and knowing how like just like a loose straw can just like contaminate the whole thing. It really does call into question, am I really making a difference? But then you just have to look upstream and be like, well, I just gotta buy less,
Yeah,
which is also not the like the ethos of America.
absolutely not. Oh my gosh. And I've been inspired by many people, yourself included, to like really wean off of my like Amazon consumption. Because
Mm-hmm.
like the packaging in itself, and also just like how the business practices are just awful. But it's really difficult because America just makes it so easy to be a wasteful person.
You're like encouraged.
Yeah, you really are. You really are. It's so difficult to not do that. And it calls to the conversation like fatigue. And we could talk about fatigue of like so many things, but like it's, I don't know why, like things are just designed to not be good for the world in a
I
lot
know.
of.
I know. And it's not just like one aspect of it. It's like many. It's like like many industries, and it all coalesces and it's all bad. And you're like, well, where do I fucking begin?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I like my social justice radar turned on in college, I want to say. Like before
Mm-hmm.
that, I want to say I didn't really know, I didn't really care about social justice in general. I didn't think it was like super relevant to me because I've grown up as a very privileged person all my life. But when that radar turned on, I was like, I don't even know what to do because everything is wrong. Like everything is wrong with the world. All the systems are broken. And like you can do your one part in one piece of it, but if everything else is broken, then this is still broken.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting because it sounds weird to say this, but I really don't think my social justice anything was activated until grad school. Because I had focus areas and had things that I cared about. And in college I was the recycling girl because I like ran the like tailgate waste diversion practices at USC. I don't know if you remember seeing that. And and like in high school, like whenever we needed to make like speeches in class, I was like, single-use plastic is bad. But in terms of thinking very critically about institutions and organizations and how these pieces come together, I really don't think that part of my brain was activated until grad school. And it's ongoing, right? Because it's just the more you peel off at understanding how society fits together and comes together, the more you're like, ooh, this is a tough issue to tackle. It's the whole fatigue thing. Like I'll give you an example. Like we've been seeing so much about arresting the cops that killed Breonna Taylor, right? That's like the mantra of the year almost. It's been the mantra of social media for the past couple of months, certainly. But it depends on how the police report was written. And if there is nothing there, then no matter how much public pressure you put on the department, it's not going to happen. Because there's like another deeper systemic thing there that is the blocker.
Mm-hmm.
And in the absence of knowing that, you're kind of just like, it's easy to affect change, or like, why isn't this thing happening? But you have to go one step below and look at the actual legal system, right? The rules and the way things need to be done. And then that's hard, because it's kind of like the difference between defunding police and thinking very critically about dismantling our criminal justice system, where I think I drew a flow chart on Instagram where it's like, if you defund police, then like fewer people will leak through and be prosecuted and like be given unfair sentences. And that is a whole thing that needs to be addressed also. But maybe you can slow the trickle of people that's getting put into the system. But you still gotta address the system. Mm-hmm. And the system is where it gets tricky, because that's like legislation and laws and bills and the very fabric that holds our society together. And that's, and thinking about how to change that is like, I don't even know where to begin. And it's depressing to think about, because you're like, well, then what's the point actually if there are legal, like literal legal barriers?
Yeah, it's crazy to think about, and it has been very depressing to think about. But also, I don't know, we're learning so much, and I think the whole collective is learning so much, and just having the veil lifted of not just looking at the surface level, but looking at the whole system. And I'm sure, I mean, like, that has to count for something, that everyone is being a little bit more educated on how things are, and like not just taking everything at surface level. I've even like I've even posted some things on Instagram where it's like, okay, X, Y, and Z business, like, do these awful practices, and then I get DMs back of like, oh, what were the sources for this? Like, I don't want to like cancel this random business just because there was an Instagram post. And I was like, Wow, that's amazing. Like that is a question that people are asking, because I think we want to take the easy route of just being like, all right, well, screw that business, like I'll just believe everything. But I think we're getting to like a more critical point of view, which is great. Which is great.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. I think yeah, because the veil has been lifted now, and it is hard to be comfortable with going back to the way things were before, right? And this is I think both on a micro level in terms of like your day to day and how you engage, but broadly thinking about like 2020 elections, right? That's like many steps up, but there were so many calls when, it was kind of like when it was just like just accepted that Biden was going to be the de facto candidate, that things would go back to normal. And it's like, no, but things cannot go back to normal because communities were hurting then too. We need to address that. And now the pandemic has added another layer on top of that, where it's like there is no normal anymore. We have to completely reconceptualize society, because there's no way not to do that, right? To do that would be almost like committing that would be negligent, right? To say like, oh, we'll just go back to the way things were, like just give everybody a vaccine and like that's it.
Yeah.
And so I do think 2020 is in this like this is a year of reckoning, and I'm cautiously optimistic about how we're going to come out at the end of all of this, whether that's 2021 or 2022 or beyond. We don't really know at this point, because like we've seen that sustained public pressure and engagement can bring about change, right? Like the Minnesota Police Department is like, city council is like bringing forth a motion to consider defunding the police entirely, right? New York City, even though it was just a little bit of like accounting magic, they like diverted $1 billion away from the like NYPD budget. But people are looking now, right? And people saw that even though that's what they said, it was just some accounting magic underneath, like whatever. And people called them out on that. And like same in LA, it's like, we're going to take away 150 million. People are like, that's not enough.
That's not enough. Yeah, that's very little, just a fraction. Doesn't even move the graph very much at all if you were to visit.
Yeah, exactly. You're like, I still have to scroll like a million times to get to the end. So I think you're right? Like I think things are changing absolutely for the better, and that is very hopeful. But also like, even if things weren't changing and you weren't even sure whether or not the thing that you're doing is going to make a difference, it can come down to a very selfish reason of, I'm doing this so that at the end of the day, I feel better and I feel like I did something. Even if you don't know if it's going to lead to something, it can be as selfish as that.
Yeah.
And I think that's reason enough, right? For people just to like try to move things along.
Yeah, totally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that we maybe think too much about ourselves and like, am I doing it for the right reasons, etc. If it makes you feel better and it's advancing society in some way, that's okay. It's okay that you feel better about it.
Yeah.
It's okay for you to feel good about yourself. Give yourself a little pat on the back.
I know, it's like, it's so wild that people are like, if you donated and it was because you wanted to be known that you were a philanthropist, you did it for the wrong reasons. And I'm like, I'm happy to take this.
It's fine. It's like, yeah, keep the money coming. It's okay.
It's like so odd, and I actually don't know where that mentality comes from, but it really goes against like the like individualism and like the giving back aspects of society. So I'm kind of just like, I don't know why I shame people for that.
Yeah, totally. Okay, another thing that I wanted to talk about, and this gets like a little dicey because I know that there's rhetoric around like, don't compare racist struggles to like anything else because it's not an apples to apples comparison. The experience is
Mm-hmm.
very different. But like
Mm-hmm.
I've found it very helpful to think about racism in relation or in parallel to like feminism, or like
Yes.
even the blend of like white feminism that I have grown up on.
Yeah.
And I watched one of your, this is like kind of a mixed question or mixed conversation. I watched one of your IGTVs
Mm-hmm.
recently, or maybe it was a while ago now, where you said you've noticed that it has been primarily your female friends who have come to work,
Yeah.
and like just generally speaking. And I totally feel the same. Like I tend to see more females speaking out about all sorts of social justice issues more often than males. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think it is. I think it's several pronged. One, absolutely the privilege aspect of it, because it's like you know what it feels like to be discriminated against, and you know what it feels like to be like, there's a group of guys walking towards me. Are they gonna say anything about my appearance? Do I have to, like, where do I look? Do I look straight ahead? Do I look on the ground? Do I look to the side? Do I cross the street? Right? It's like, so the tension is there and you feel it and it is very real. And so I think that's absolutely like right to tap into that, because it's just like, like women and people who pass for women of the world, right? Who are like female passing, like unites, like, you know, the struggle. It is very, very hard. The other side of it is also, I think, clout and brand. And
Okay.
which is like, okay, all right, like whatever it takes to get you to that point. But it's like like I think generally speaking, women care more about their social media presence. They care a little bit more about their brand. It's almost like, you know how like if you go out with a group of girls or even with one other girls, you're gonna be like, okay, what am I gonna wear, right? And there's this whole dance of like, I gotta look really good, and it's not because you're trying to impress your friend
Yeah.
even, or you're trying to impress the world, but it's like there is the vibe, and you gotta fit the vibe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, so I think so. Yeah. So I think it's a little bit of both. I think also like women are just so conditioned to be the emotional caretakers of the world that, and maybe this comes down to like just the way society is structured and gender roles, but that they feel like it is their duty to speak up, right? They feel this duty to speak out against injustice, to try to do something about it. And that is, again, like nature or nurture, I'm not sure, but it has now become innate.
Yeah, for sure. Oh,
Yeah.
fascinating. Your second point about clout and brand, I didn't even think about that, but I think that's so true. I definitely think that has to do with it. Wasn't my first thought, but that is interesting. But
Mm-hmm.
some of my thoughts on comparing feminism to racism, it really helps me understand the whole like movement for Black Lives a little bit more, just because I mean I've been a lot more connected to the feminist movement than I have of the movement for Black Lives. So thinking about all of the like conversation that's been happening in the past like couple months, one of the things that I thought about was like self-education, right? Like don't put it on Black folks to educate you, go out and seek your own education. And
Mm-hmm.
it made sense to me. I was like, okay, yeah, like we shouldn't like put it on them. We should go out and educate ourselves. But when I
Mm-hmm.
thought about it in parallel to feminism, that has been something that has frustrated me so much about like why don't men understand. First of all, they don't understand because you talk to them about certain things and they're like, you can just see issues like going over their head, or it's like that that blank look of like, oh, I have literally never thought about this before. I've literally never had that concern or that thought cross my mind. And I'm like, what? Like, okay, I understand, but I'm telling you, like, think about it right now and talk to me about it. Like, I'll give you an example. The other day, I read this article on like this woman's fertility journey, and she was just like, she's a little bit older and she was having trouble having kids. And like you see her go through like rounds of IVF and like different types of fertility treatments. And I was like, oh, this is so interesting. And that's just something that like I will read up on just as a personal interest. And like I have taken to like saving those things and then like sharing them out to other males because I'm like, this is something that you should know. But a couple years ago, I was like, why don't they do this themselves? Why don't they
Mm,
just educate and like learn about these things? Uh,
yeah.
but then obviously with the whole Black Lives Matter movement, I was like, oh, I didn't educate myself on things that weren't necessarily relevant to me at the time. So I see
Mm,
both sides now.
yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I also see both sides because I think it's like, on one hand, I've talked about this before. If only women ever talked about women's issues, then it just solely becomes the domain of the women, right? Like it's like women then only have expertise in this one area, and like doesn't matter what they say outside of that. It's that the fact that they're saying anything at all that's problematic, right? So just having these spheres is highly problematic. But on the other hand, it's like, yeah, like we have this fear here of women's issues, but because it's women's issues, men literally never have to think about that. They don't even know that it exists. They don't know the struggles. They don't know the pain points. They didn't even know this was like a thing that they could even engage on. And so then it's your responsibility, if you feel up to it, to take it to them. Because then again, I think my motto for the year is just like, you got to meet people where they're at. You have to bring it to them. You have to give it to them also in a way that is digestible to them.
Yep.
Yeah.
I that was my thought process for like a number of years. I was like, okay, I will just be the one to like bring this to you and like
Mm-hmm.
have a discussion, do a little bit of education cuz like
Mm-hmm.
I mean, ignorance is its own problem, but like willful ignorance is the problem, right? But if you're just ignorant and you just don't know any better, like I'll give you a pass. And I think it's only recently where I was like frustrated because of this whole conversation around self-education that I was like, huh, why don't dudes self-educate about women's issues? Like, it is exhausting having to educate people.
It is so tiring having to educate people. But then you're like, but if I don't do it, will they do it? And does that make it worth it for me?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think it comes back to like the individual. Like, what are you comfortable doing? Like, can
Mm-hmm.
you take it on? And I guess for the most part, I've my answer has been like, yeah, okay, I could do it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But then this is also like, this is exactly why allyship is so important, right? Because of the whole sphere thing, where it's like, if someone talking about this issue within the sphere is only going to be seen as like, oh, that's just like another person talking about it,
Mhm.
versus if a man were to say, fertility is a huge issue, like that's something that women, like, you know, like that places undue burden on the women, and like
Mhm.
the government needs to, like, I don't know, like fund it more or something,
Yeah.
right? Like more men just like started speaking for Planned Parenthood, that would totally change the game.
Yeah.
Would totally change the fucking game.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think for men in particular, it's hard. Or like the more privilege you have, the harder it is to get involved because I see the argument of like it's not my fight,
Yeah.
it's not my place to do something. Like
Mm-hmm.
as a woman of color, like I have something to like kind of latch on to say,
Yeah.
okay, well maybe it's not maybe I would have thought it's not my fight for Black Lives Matter, but I can relate to the women's movement. So like, okay, I get it. Maybe I should be speaking out more here. But
Yeah.
the more privilege you have, the less you have something to latch onto to say like, okay, maybe I should get involved. Because then maybe nothing is your fight, right?
Yeah. And I think there is also an element of toxic masculinity in this, which is just like, which is awful, right? And I was thinking about this recently. Like I would much rather be an Asian woman than an Asian man. I would much rather be a white man than a white woman.
Mm-hmm.
I think I would much rather be a Black woman than a Black man, although that one is really hard.
That one's hard. That one's really tough.
Because it fucking sucks to be Black in America.
Yeah.
And it's the way masculinity and toxic masculinity can shape identities, and that just sucks.
It really does. It
Yeah.
really does. Yeah, I think toxic masculinity definitely doesn't get talked about as much because we're the feminist movement, the forefront is like women's advancement,
Yeah.
and not necessarily about toxic masculinity, which is very interrelated. So yeah, I think that is something that we should talk about more so that more guys can get behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just like it's hard to broach also because it requires you opening yourself up to a level of comfort with yourself and your audience. This is like, yeah, this is like, it's hard to be a man, and these are the things that I go through. And you also have to you also need that person to recognize that, right? Because it's like, do you recognize it in yourself? Can you name it? Can you talk about it? And then can you do something about it? And most times people don't even touch that first part. Like they don't even know like what they're going through.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, people don't know that like, oh, I feel shame about this for a certain reason. It's just like, nope, not gonna touch it.
Yeah. It's like, I'm going to pivot. I'm going to do work now because that's how I cope.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my gosh. Okay, I feel like we could go on forever and we would have so much to talk about and so many more like little tangents to go off of and things to relate to. But I feel like this is a good stopping point. So thanks so much, Leslie. This is such a great conversation. Let's do it again sometime and we can talk about all of those other things.
That's what I was going to say. I feel like, well, also like because of the pandemic, I'm like, I need to talk to people, and like, who are all the friends that I enjoy talking with? But it's just more and more I find that I like am seeking out conversations like these. It goes back to the like, what is normal versus what is the new normal. It's like, I don't need to talk about buying things anymore. Like I still can, but there's so many more interesting things that you can talk to people about. And you're definitely someone who thinks about that on the reg. So yeah, let's do this again.
Yay. Yes, we will. Okay. Well, thanks, Leslie. Thanks again.
Yes. Thank you for having me. I'll talk to you soon.